Some people will try to tell you that the idea of a free market is sacred. If you ask them why, it's likely that you'll hear something about how a free and unrestricted competition will result in the success of the best ideas as consumers choose to buy from the better businesses and the worst businesses and ideas will fail. You will probably also hear about how only the people participating in the market can make the right decisions about what the market should do. This theoretical power of the collective decisions of consumers is what Adam Smith referred to as the invisible hand of the market. Proponents of the free market ideal will tell you that because of this, only a totally free market can be expected to produce the most efficient solutions, and any attempt by the government or anyone else to restrict the freedom of the market through regulation or socializing of anything will necessarily make things worse, since no person, not even the government, can obtain perfect enough information to be able to effectively improve market efficiency. There are a couple of immediate problems with this. Namely, the relatively modern and reluctant realization of economics that people are not fully rational, as well as the fact that there's a lot of evidence that government intervention can and has led to wildly efficient and productive outcomes in various countries across the world. On the first, I would suggest reading into behavioral economics and complexity economics. For the second, I recommend reading about things 12 and 16 in Ha-Joon Chang's 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. But I won't be talking about those problems today. The thing that I want to talk about today is this. Even if we assume that the invisible hand functions exactly as theorized, does that actually imply that a freer market is always more efficient? The answer, as you'll see, is no. So, sit with me a while and let's talk about why that is. In order for this to make sense, we first need a basic understanding of the supply and demand theory behind how a market is supposed to work. So the basic idea of supply is that as the price of something goes up, producers are willing to make and sell more of it. In theory, this is supposed to be because the more of something you make, the more expensive it is for you to make another one, which could happen because, for instance, there's more competition to hire workers or to buy inputs, which could raise your costs. Or maybe you have to give up more of your free time, which is more valuable to you the less of it you have to give up. For demand, the idea is that as the price of something goes down, consumers are willing to buy more of it because they have to give up less of their own resources in order to get it. The idea of a market is that when the price is so low that consumers want to buy more than the producers want to make, the price will go up. And when the price is so high that producers want to sell more than consumers want to buy, then the price will go down. Ideally, this will result in a situation where the price is exactly right so that consumers want to buy exactly as much as producers want to make. Another component of a market is the idea of competition, where businesses will have to constantly work to be as efficient and productive as physically possible. The businesses that fail at this won't be able to make money selling at the market price, and will stop operating, which will make the economy as a whole more efficient overall. Ultimately, the idea of a free market is conceived as a way for society as a whole to make decisions collectively about how much of each thing it wants to be made and used. These are the first things you learn when you study economics, but most of the things that you learn after that are all of the different ways that this system can break down and fail to reflect the actual needs of society, sometimes in truly spectacular ways. We economists have a really creative name for these different ways that markets can fail. We call them market failures. And just like anything else, when the market breaks down and stops working, something needs to be done to fix it. This is the legitimate role of government when it intervenes in an otherwise free market. The good news is that it doesn't take a professional economist to understand how markets can fail. It's all actually pretty intuitive. One of the most common ways that markets can fail is when businesses trying to reduce their costs or increase their sales might do things that have negative effects on the market or society. These are called negative externalities. The most obvious examples of this are things like a factory polluting a local river. Right? It may be cheaper for them, but it creates costs for other people who will then later have to either pay to clean up the river or just live and deal with dirty water and a degraded environment. But since the factory doesn't pay the costs, those costs are not factored into the price. So the price of whatever they produce is too low, considering its actual costs to society. This means that the market is essentially tricked into buying too much of whatever they're making. So the government regulates the factory to make sure that this doesn't happen. But it's not just about pollution. The government makes restaurants do health inspections. It stops construction companies from using asbestos. It forces corporations to undergo intensive financial and accounting inspections before they're allowed to sell their stocks. All of this is regulation that restricts the market, but it does so to protect the market from harmful practices that will reduce overall efficiency from the broader perspective of the entire economy. Negative externalities can also happen when the act of buying and using something has negative effects on someone else, like, for instance, with secondhand smoke. On the other side of that coin are positive externalities. This is when some product or service provides benefits to the society beyond just the person who buys it. Normally when you buy something, you only think about the value that it has to you, and you're willing to buy some amount of it based on that. But if that thing offers more benefit to society as a whole, then the economy as a whole, if it could think with one mind, would want more of that thing to be made and used. Here you can think of things like car insurance, or solar panels, or charitable donations. The person who pays for these things gets some benefit from it, sure. Even the guy who gives to charity gets to feel good about the fact that he's helping people. But all of these things have more benefits that the person who buys it doesn't receive. Car insurance protects the financial health of people who are harmed by your driving through no fault of their own. Solar panels help reduce pollution, which benefits everybody. Charitable donations provide valuable goods and services to people who really need them, but aren't able to pay. So the government mandates car insurance and it subsidizes solar panels and charitable donations to reduce their price and sort of transfer some of that extra benefit onto the buyer, who will then see more benefit for themselves and hopefully buy more of it. Another really good example of market failure is in the idea of public goods. Now, public goods are products that you can't stop people from using, and they can't really be used up. Now, there are no truly pure public goods, but there are a lot of things that are very close. Like, for instance, public parks, roads, law enforcement, military defense. People value roads, and society wants to produce some of them. But if you go around and ask individuals to give you money for roads, you won't collect enough money to be able to build and maintain an effective road system. This is partly because people might not see the full benefit of an extensive road system. Think positive externalities, but it's also partly because they know that they'll get to use those roads no matter who pays for them. We call this the free rider problem. In these cases, a free market will heavily undersupply such goods and services, if it even provides any at all, because there's no way for it to collect enough revenue. So the government, as an arm of society, has to step in and provide them itself, paid for with taxes and fees, which then eliminates the free rider problem entirely. Unless people evade their taxes, but that's another topic. One market failure that we don't often think about, but where we gladly let the government intervene in major ways, is when the act of producing something necessarily involves extremely high fixed costs, which is investment that you have to make before you can even start to produce and sell, and near zero cost for each new unit of production. In industries where this is the case, the average cost to produce each unit falls dramatically the more units you produce. The economic jargon for this is increasing economies of scale. The most obvious examples are utilities, things like electricity and water. If you want to pay me to provide your house with water, there has to be pipes for me to pump that water to you. That pipe network is extremely expensive to build. But once it's there, I can give you water all day for very low cost. But I have to charge a price that will make up for the high fixed costs of building and maintaining the pipes. Once I build the pipes, adding another customer on is as easy as turning on a valve to their house. So the more customers I have, the more I can spread out that high cost, which means I can charge each person lower and lower prices. Now, say someone else tries to start another company to compete with me. They can't use my pipes, so they have to build their own. And once they do, we are now competing for the same customers, each of us taking less than the total customers available. This means that we aren't spreading out that high fixed costs as much as it could be spread out, which makes prices higher. If each of us serves exactly 50% of the customers, then we're competing. But if I have more customers than he does, even a few more, I can charge lower prices, which means I can push him out of the market. In an industry like this, monopolies are formed naturally. Now, monopolies are normally bad because they'll charge higher prices and produce less than a competitive market would, which is bad for society. But in this case, monopoly is actually the least bad option for pricing and production. So what do we do? Well, if a monopoly is your only choice, then you need to regulate it to make sure that it charges the market-efficient price and produces the market-efficient amount. Either that, or you just have the government take over the industry and directly control the producer. This is exactly why you have only one option when you want to buy electricity or water. And it's also why attempts to privatize these industries, like in South Africa about 15 years ago, tend to have really horrible results. Most countries also usually have sanctioned and heavily regulated monopolies on things like public trains or city buses for the same reason. There's also a really good argument to be made that broadband internet should be treated in the same way as electricity and water, since it does tend to form natural monopolies in the same way. A particularly insidious form of market failure comes from what we call information asymmetries. This is where the producer and consumer don't know all the same things. It usually happens when hiding information is in the best interest of the business. For an example of this, look at how much government regulation and funding of information campaigns was necessary in order to show the public that smoking cigarettes was actually really bad for you, which is something that the industry and experts had known for a long time, but was being hidden from the public. The same has been happening more recently in terms of information regarding our effects on climate change. Economic development and progress can also be seriously hindered by what are called market coordination failures. This is when investment in certain businesses or industries might be the best thing for the economy as a whole, but nobody wants to be the one to do it. Like, say we need to build a port in order to allow our economy to grow and export more. That port won't be profitable until the industries in the country are developed enough for it to see enough traffic. But those industries won't be able to start developing more until a port is built. So you see, we have a sort of chicken and egg problem. To get this moving, the government will often have to either build the port itself or subsidize somebody else to build it. Without this kickstart, the economy and the market might never make that investment leap, and then it'll get stuck in what we call a suboptimal equilibrium. Most commonly, governments will try to support economic and industrial growth on this principle through subsidizing things like research and development. This market coordination problem is related closely to the topic of industrial policy, which is actually my personal academic area of expertise, so maybe we can talk about it in more detail in the future. There are, of course, even more examples of how market failures can happen, but I think this is a good enough list for this video. Although I do encourage you to go and read more on the topic if you're curious. Personally, I find it fascinating. The lesson that I want to communicate today is that government intervention in a market, whether through regulation or direct action, can be not only a positive thing for economic efficiency, but sometimes it can be downright necessary. And this happens far more often than you might think. The irony is that almost nobody really disagrees on this point. Today, nobody questions the laws requiring car manufacturers to install seatbelts or restaurants to pass health inspections. Nobody argues for a private police force. Nobody complains about government-controlled and supported monopolies for water utilities. People who try to tell you that a free market is always better either don't understand what they're talking about or they're being disingenuous. Finally, free market advocates are often some of the most aggressive in favor of restricting immigration, which is one of the biggest market interventions that the government does, since a truly free market would be one where labor is perfectly mobile, in other words, one with completely open borders. Even the revered god of laissez-faire, Adam Smith himself, in the very same book where he talked about the invisible hand of the market, also mentioned that the government should prevent businesses and the wealthy from sacrificing the public good for their own benefit, that they should protect property rights, that it should build and maintain public works, regulate international trade, and even pay fully for the education of the working class. All of this is patently anti-free market, from the pen of Adam Smith himself. In truth, the disagreements that we have about government intervention and government programs are not about whether or not the government should interfere, but about when and where it's necessary. There has never been a truly free market in the history of the world, because no one has ever actually wanted one. To quote Cambridge economics professor Ha-Joon Chang, "Every market has some rules and boundaries that restrict freedom of choice. A market looks free only because we so unconditionally accept its underlying restrictions that we fail to see them." I think it's important to point this out because many who argue against government intervention won't tell you this, and instead they'll try to trick you into thinking that it's always bad because of some secret immutable law of economics. But that law, it doesn't exist. Hey, if you like what you're seeing, feel free to like and subscribe. It'll help me out, and it'll also help me get this information to hopefully more people who really need to hear it. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.